Let's do it.
Cool. All right. So welcome, everyone. Today is Thursday, August 26th in the year 2021. And this is the podcast, Get Smarter and Make Stuff. And today I am really happy to welcome somebody on the show that, I've talked a bunch with about making things. And in fact, we've been working together, making a company, his company, in fact, for quite some time now. And that would be James Avery. Welcome to the show, James.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Craig.
Yeah, no problem. So as I just vaguely alluded to there, you are actually my boss's boss. You are the CEO of Kevel, where I work. But beyond that, you're also a maker and a learner. And you've made software, you've made things in wood. We've had a lot of conversations about making things for fun and professionally and so forth. So I thought it'd be really fun to talk to you. As people who listen to the show know, kind of the general idea here is really it's that I talk to interesting people and they are interesting. But we sort of have this general framework of, let's talk about making and let's talk about learning. And usually at this point in the show, we kind of throw it open and say, hey, James, what are you, what's been going on with you in the making and learning world? And then we talk about whatever that might be. So maybe I'll throw it to you. If you feel like introducing yourself at all, feel free to do that. But we can also just jump straight into your adventures in making learning. Really, it's up to you. So go.
Sounds good. Yeah. I mean, I joining before when you invited me on the podcast, I was kind of like, wow, you've had Paul and Tim that we both work with, and they're always showing off, these like amazing things they're working on. And I'm like, well, what do I spend most of my time making? And at the end of the day, it really is Kevel. Like it's the company we both work at and that we've been building together, and people like Tim and Paul and a bunch of other great people. And like you said earlier, like my company, but I think of it as like our company. Like I founded it, but everybody here has ownership. And I think that's where especially as we started to grow. So like as a little context, I think when you joined, you were probably, we were like sub 20 people.
Oh yeah. It was between 12 and 18, somewhere in that range.
Yeah. Like something in that range. And so, when you're that size, yeah, you can kind of coordinate everything through Slack. Like, I don't even remember if you reported to me or you reported to somebody else, but it was like a fairly like flat structure.
Yeah.
And now we're like 70 plus people. And I now feel like I'm kind of like what I'm making is like trying to figure out like, how do you make this company from like an organizational standpoint to, really get stuff done.
Mm-hmm.
And like the same, like the title of the podcast, like how do we as a company learn and make stuff, right? Like that's the key thing we need to do.
Yeah. I mean, I've been involved in interviewing people because as you might imagine, going from 15-ish to 70-ish people in less than 5 years since I started, we've grown a lot. We've hired a lot. We've done really well in hiring. I think that's a place where we've been a combination of lucky and good. Anyway, a thing that I comment on is that I think we've sort of been appropriately cautious, afraid might not even be too strong of a word about growth, right? Like, because there's these critical numbers. They're called Dunbar Numbers, where when organizations reach them, there's a phase shift needs to happen. And one of the important ones that I've seen, at least in my career, is around 15 people. Because 15 people is you talk to everybody every day. And 25 people is that doesn't make any sense. And then another one is 40 people-ish, where it goes from, everybody effectively works for the CEO to not everybody can work for the CEO. And it's probably even a little bit short of 40, but right around that number. And I've actually seen plenty of companies that have like smashed into that 40 barrier and failed to break through it. Like the organizational complexities, sort of defeated them. And it's been really satisfying to me to see us both progress as we went towards that number, to be really like cognizant of that we could make some bad mistakes, and to see us successfully transition through that. Because in my opinion, we do have an organization that, while not perfect, has successfully made the transition past 40, where it still works. Like silly things for the most part are not happening. So anyway, so it might be, I know it's a lot of words for me, but I'm actually really interested to hear your perspective on what it was like from where you sit to make that happen, and what you've learned.
Yeah, I think that for me, like one of the big things I learned was early on, I would hire people and then have people report to them, hire people to run a group or run a group of people. But I did a really poor job of giving up control. And I think anybody listening to Kevel would probably maybe say I still have a problem with that, but I think I've gotten better, overall. And I think the big lesson I learned there was really trying to hire people in areas who were dramatically better than me in that given area. Right. So I think like there was a big shift at Kevel when it went from either me managing the engineers or being very, very involved in like the day to day of engineering work to bringing in our friend Tim, to run the engineering group. And Tim knows way more than me about that. He's a better architect, coder, engineering manager, woodworker than I am. And like, I think that was like a big point of like leveling up where, it's like I used to talk to every engineer before we hired him. And then I got to the point and it was like, well, if Tim and Craig and Paul and some of the other great engineers we have here are talking to these engineers, like what am I going to bring to the table here? And that was like a good realization. Like I think when companies like stumble at that 40 number, I think a lot of times it's because the CEO like won't relinquish control. Like won't say like, oh, I trust these people to make the right decision on hiring and bring in the right people and architect things the right way. And like, dealing with like, Paul, when he's talking about some of the stuff he architects, he just, I like to think I was, or am a good engineer, but when he gets into the weeds on stuff, I'm like, okay, I trust you. Like, let's do that.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm curious, usually on the show, we talk about, sort of the making of physical objects, although, software too, because a lot of my friends are people that make virtual things. But I wonder if as you have developed this thing, Kevel, this organization, if you've had any thoughts about ways in which it is similar to physical objects that you've made. Is it at all like woodworking, or is it something that doesn't really resonate? It's just a different thing.
I think what's interesting, like I do think like the org, like and how you like design or build the org does feel a lot like, architecting a software system or, coming up with the plan of how you're going to build, or like, I rebuilt my deck, like how you're going to rebuild your deck, right? Like in a similar way, you're kind of trying to come up with these things that you're building something that you're going to be stuck with for a certain amount of time. And you don't yet know all the edge cases and the things that are going to come up. And sometimes you end up, like when building my deck, like ending up cutting some really weird jigsaw piece because you planned how the boards were laid out wrong. And you do the same thing, like in an org chart. Sometimes, like there's a role that's kind of like a jigsaw piece where they have like 5 different responsibilities that seem like an odd collection. But I think like the biggest thing, like tying back to making, the biggest thing I've noticed in like running a company and figuring out the organization and hiring people is the real like delayed gratification of it, and struggling with that as somebody who came from being like a software engineer, where I feel like as a software engineer or doing woodworking or working on my deck, you get some instant gratification, right? Like a lot of times you can like work on a bug, work on that for a day, get it shipped out. You log off your computer and you're like, I accomplished something today. The like support team was happy, customer was happy, great, right? You get kind of like an endorphin hit, or but when you're running a company, it feels like so many times it's like when we're doing a hire or making a change, it can be 6 months or 9 months before you know if you were right or if what you did had a good impact or a bad impact. And so I found like as I did more and more, as my job has like stepped more and more back from writing that line of code, that's when I started doing more and more stuff around the house with, like I redid my deck, or I've been demoing my garage. That's a little more destruction, but it still feels good. Those things that you do get that feeling of like, I wake up on a Saturday, I go and, demo out a big part of the kind of old cabinets in the garage. I start to think about how do I want to rebuild these? But you get that like instant satisfaction of like, I did something today. And I think that's like a big shift for people when they move, if they move from like individual contributing to more management, is that you don't get that kind of immediate satisfaction of like doing something concrete.
Yeah, so this is really interesting for a couple reasons. One is you're far from the first person I've heard say, yeah, I really enjoy management. I'm glad I made the transition, but I miss engineering per se. And I don't know that I've ever heard anybody say that it's the immediacy of it, like the timelines that are a key piece. So that's an interesting piece, especially because as you were saying that when you started talking about it, my brain actually went in the opposite direction, and I thought about all the times that when I'm making something, I'm impatient, and like I'm like, oh, my shop is a mess right now because I go in there, I work on something, I set the tool down, and then I work on something else, and I set the tool down rather than like stopping to like put it away or finish what I'm working on. So that's interesting. And then the other piece that we've heard from a lot of people on the show is that when they go and make things at the end of the day or on the weekends or during not work, it's important to them that it be different, right? That like a lot of us that are a little long in the tooth, like we've been doing software for a while, we we do something that's not software, and it's important that it be not software. And so I just wonder whether you could comment on any of that. Like, do you find that it is the making of things, that it is the fact that it is not the building of a company that's important, or is there something else to it, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've actually started playing around, writing some code, not for Kevel. You guys won't let me do that anymore. But like on the side, like my daughter's been learning to code, and we were kind of learning Rust together, and it was really fun. Like we were, I was playing with Cloudflare workers and like spinning them up and seeing if I could get Rust to run in them, and I actually found that really satisfying. Just because I guess on my day to day, like I don't code anymore, so it is very, very different from what I do. I think on my time off, it's like the last thing I'd want to do is go, manage a team. Actually, this came up recently with some friends of ours who we would play board games with, and I, they wanted to play one of these like cooperative board games, and I was like, I have zero interest in this. I'm like, you know why? I'm like, this is what I do all day long, is talk to a bunch of other people about how we accomplish a goal, and then like argue about if it's the right way or the wrong way, and then we kind of find out if it was right or wrong.
Oh, that's hilarious.
I'm like, if I'm going to play a board game, I want to play one where I get to make every decision. I own every outcome, and I get to either beat all of you or I get to lose to all of you. And like, that's my only interest.
I love that. You know why? One of the reasons I love that is because I think there's this mistaken view, or suboptimal view anyway, of the CEO as being the decider of all things. And the fact that you see like being the one person in control of all the decisions as being the opposite of what you do every day it speaks very well of you as a leader, I think. But it's also just kind of funny in the juxtaposition with the stereotype.
Yeah, I'm probably a pain in the ass to play cooperative games with too, because there's probably times where I'm acting like the CEO at work versus a equal member of a team. But that is how I try to think of myself anyway, right? Like I think even at work, like I'm not trying to hand down like this is I make every decision, because then usually doesn't work out very well.
Yeah, I mean, I won't spend too much time, kissing up here, but I will say that I do brag to pretty much everybody that we interview that Kevel is an organization where it's very humane, actually, is the way I put it, right? Like, we have this employee bill of rights, which is just down to you. Like, you get credit for this. It's awesome, actually. And one of the various tenets that kind of embedded in that is everyone is an adult, which really is about respect, right? And so you can have an opinion different from James, and it doesn't mean that we'll do what you say, but it does mean that you will be listened to. But I really do think that like you've done a great job in creating an environment where it genuinely is like that. It really is like cooperative, collaborative, and fun to work in for that reason.
Yeah, but I think it kind of goes back to the making part, which is like when I was starting the company, one of the things I thought about was like I want to build a company that I want to work at, not as CEO, but like as an employee. Because you look at a lot of companies where, there's like a caste system almost, right? Like
Sure.
the CEO and the executives do this, but then everybody else has this. And like I've always pushed to totally stay away from that. And I think like even to this day, I feel like my only executive privilege that I exercise is like I can't stand filing expense reports. So, so I have somebody do that for me. But at the end of the day, it's like, if I, when I've worked at companies, like it was, you just want to be treated like an adult. I remember there was a company I went to as a software engineer one time, and they were kind of a more traditional company, and you had to clock in and out as a software engineer.
Mm.
And I'm just like, really? Like this is really what we're doing? Or there's another one where you had to wear like a suit, or not a suit, but you had to wear a tie to work every day. And I'm like, this is just absurd to me that we're not just treating people as adults and saying, look, you're coming to work. You should, be presentable, but like giving people dress codes for how engineers come to work. It also made it really hard to recruit engineers since most engineers don't know how to tie a tie. But, and I think actually for that job, I might have had to Google it. But yeah, I think it's just a key thing of like how, what kind of company do I want to work at? And I think that's how a lot of us build stuff in our spare time too, right? Like you're building something that you want, that you're going to use. So I think it's really the same approach taken to building the company.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you mentioned something, you learning to, or not learning to, but teaching your daughter to program. How old is she?
She's 13 now.
Okay, I actually have a 13-year-old daughter too. And I did spend some time with my older daughter, and to some degree with the younger one, when they were both considerably younger. I actually often thought that when they got older would be a good time to start to tackle, we were doing Scratch and whatever some of the other sort of visual programming languages were. How has that been? And did you go into it with any kind of a plan, or did she ask for it, or was it your idea, or how's it been going?
Yeah, I never tried to really push it on them.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that, sure, like coding is a very good skill to have. Like we've all experienced that firsthand. But I also didn't want to like make it something like they had to do. But she actually got interested in it, I think, just because she loves a lot of these like simulation games and things like that on Steam. And, she knows, what we do, and she understands that, kind of the role of technology. She's really kind of, she thinks about the future in a way I don't think I ever did as like a 13-year-old. She's like, well, I want to make sure I have a good career. I want to make sure that, I can make money. I want to understand, how all of this stuff works.
Wow.
I feel like at 13, I was like, just trying to figure out how to get to like the next part of Final Fantasy or whatever.
Right. Yeah, totally.
And so, yeah, she asked about coding, and I was like, well, what is it? Like, how does it work? Like, and then we had tried like I pointed her to some like the stuff like Scratch like before, and it didn't really like take off. But now I think she's a little bit older. She was really interested, and I thought, like I'm not going to try to, the initial instinct I think for a lot of people is like kind of web technologies. But whenever I think about that, I'm like, there's so much stuff going on here, and I think back to like how, like how do you learn in the most like pure way, like picking, a language that you can just run stuff in the console. And I had been like kind of going through the Rust book online, and so I thought, hey, like you want to do this? And she was like, sure. So we just got her laptop set up. She started reading through the Rust book, would bring her laptop down, and, the first time, right, she's like writing the instructions into the code block. And I'm like, no, you can't do that. You got to take these out. And she's kind of moving along. And then over the summer, we actually signed her up for there was like a code camp locally where she was going to learn. She did a bunch of stuff in Python, which is maybe a better language to learn at first than Rust. But yeah, I think it's been going well. Now since school started for us on Monday. So now that's kind of taking up more time. I'm not sure if she'll have as much time to spend on it.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, it's been great. And I think, this is maybe a controversial opinion. Like, I don't think just coding is like the best skill for the future. I think that coding with a combination of like, well, coding with like this combination of other knowledge. Like I just think, like as we like build more and more services that make it easier and easier to build things, you're always going to need a certain level of engineer to build those back-end services, like what we do at Kevel or AWS and things like that. But then more and more, I feel like if you're, a lawyer, there's going to be people who have a legal background, but then also know enough about coding that they can use a lot of the different tools out there, like APIs and things like that. And they're going to have like an unfair advantage because they know the context so well. So I've always kind of told her, I'm like, look, coding is something like you could focus your life on this if you really love it. If you really want to dig deep and become a great engineer, I think it's great. But I think like the idea of just like, everybody should learn to code and they only know how to code, I don't think is that valuable. But I think what's really interesting about a lot of the new coders coming into the market, like people who go to code schools, is a lot of times they come from other areas, right? Like they had a profession before, they have this knowledge, and those can be some of the most valuable people at a company. Like if you're building something for doctors and you can have a doctor who turned coder, like that's probably the best person, even if they're not as good a pure coder, right? Because they actually understand the problem space so well.
Sure.
So it's interesting. We'll see I think she's really fascinated with business too. So maybe some combination of the two.
That is awesome. And gosh, everything you said leads me like 4 more fascinating topics. I think we're going to need to, I usually say this at the end and it's because it's true, but I'll say it right now. We're going to have you back on, James, because you've already like overflowed my buffer with things I want to talk about. One of them is, you use the word engineer. And so one of the things about Kevel that is, it's not unique, far from unique, in fact, but it's certainly a little different than other places I've been, is that we don't tend to use the words developer or coder very much. And certainly in our job titles, we use the term engineer. Now, my education, I went to school to be an electrical. My degree is in electrical engineering. And, there's civil engineering and whatnot. And these disciplines are often seen as being pretty different from what we do in software. But I really like the term software engineer. I think it describes what we ought to be doing, not necessarily what we do all the time, but what we ought to aspire to. Like the discipline is software engineering. What I mean specifically by that is that it is possible to take a more structured and thoughtful approach and to understand, we don't have materials the way that a mechanical engineer would, or even an electrical engineer is working with things that have, physical properties. But to understand kind of the characteristics of things like networks and things like databases, that these are our materials and that they can be engineered, or that we should aspire to producing works that are works of engineering rather than works that are coded, or even the term hacker. None of these terms are bad. I'm not saying that they are. Like, they all have their place, but like the fact that we use the term engineering, I think speaks to a philosophy that if it wasn't sort of intentionally decided on, is something that has emerged from our luck and or skill in hiring like really good software people who then just sort of do a thing that is in this direction of what I think of as engineering. Does any of that make sense? And is that, I don't know if that term originated with you or if it's something that you did explicitly or what?
Yeah, no, it was explicit, and I think it does make sense. And it actually, it's funny. It comes up from time to time when people talk about, like are we hiring out of, coding schools, or are we, why don't we have more junior, software developers? And I think it comes to the fact that like what we do is hard, right? Like we're building like the infrastructure that other people are building on. We're doing things that are, being called tens and 30,000 times a second, and low latency. And it really is, it's an engineering practice, right? Like it is closer to engineering. I know some people get, with engineering degrees get upset when, somebody like me with no degree calls themselves a software engineer. But I think that there is like a difference there. And that when I used to do consulting, you'd meet a lot of, people who were software developers. Like they would do a very good job of kind of moving forms around on a page, and we go in there and help to improve it because it could only handle 5 users at a time, right? Because it was written with a nasty ORM and was causing all kinds of contention and things like that. And Craig may or may not have cleaned up some of my code at Kevel that was doing the same thing.
Hey, that code got us a long way. Like I know I've in the past said things like, "Oh, this code," and then something not complimentary. But hey, it got us where we are. So
yeah, no, and I think like it's funny when I look back. I don't know that I was as much of a software engineer as like the people we hire and that work at Kevel. Because going back to that, like when I look at code, to me, what matters is like how much value do we deliver,
mm-hmm.
And which is important, but it's also important to say, well, how much can it scale, and can it continue to scale, and is it correct, and can it be maintained? But yeah, like when it goes to the engineering piece, like we just have to hire people who have a different level of kind of discipline about how they build things than a company that's maybe building like an internal company building a line of business app, right? And like I used to go build those apps, and they were usually over engineered because they would hire some software engineers to build it. And it's like, look, like 7 people at your company are going to use this app to enter in insurance claims.
Right.
Like it doesn't need to have like all this different, service oriented architecture and all these levels. It's like 7 people are going to use this. Like you could literally just give them each a connection to the database and move on.
Right.
And so like, I think that's we have to hire people who are actually engineers. And I think that is a big difference. And I think we've tried to cultivate that. I think it's gone well. I do think that like at some point it would be good for us to be able to hire in more junior engineers and people out of code schools. But as we continue to build kind of infrastructure services, it's just hard to find the place we can really bring them in. And especially in like our kind of culture where, it very much is a lot of times you're kind of left on your own to make decisions. It's not, here's your, we don't have a scrum master that says, here's your 2 tickets, Craig, for this week.
Right.
Get those done and there's everything in there. And then you can push them to the next queue and the QA team will test them. Right. It's a little more ad hoc than that.
Right. Yeah, that actually, so this is all, it leads back to the thing I just remembered that I wanted to ask you before, but I'll come to that in a second. So the thing that when you're talking about this reminds me, so I started out at the very, very beginning of my career, I was an intern at a company where I was doing electrical engineering work because that's what I was studying. And it was a company that was building hardware. And so it was real engineering. I mean, I don't want to say software is not real engineering, but just I think you know what I mean by that. But what was interesting to me when I think back on the rest of my career in software is there was a very clear distinction between the technicians and the engineers. And it's not that there was, like you say, a caste system. Not at all. They were just good at different things. Like the designs would come from the engineers, and the technicians, for the most part, would build and repair them. And obviously, at any good organization where you're doing that, there's communication back and forth, and your technicians understand engineering principles, and your engineers understand enough about how things get built to not make a thing that the technicians are going to look at it and go, this can't possibly work. It'll melt because it doesn't have heat dissipation or whatever the thing was. And I think when I think about that in the context of software, again, like I said, I think the term engineering is not a perfect fit, but it is a wonderful thing to keep in mind as we think about what kind of software we're building, is that there is a place for that split. Maybe not 100%, but like that some of the work is technician work. Because I think one of the things that happens is that as developers, I'm not referring to any person in particular, but sort of broadly in the culture, there's this notion, there's this fantasy, this stereotype that we're innovating. When we sit down to type in code, that we are solving something big, important, and hard every single time we type. And the truth is that's just not the case. Some of what we do is technician work, which is not to say that it's unimportant, right? Like the technicians, without them, we never would have been able to build the things we built. But they weren't innovating. They were solving a problem using a set of techniques that were known to work. And I think that's an activity that in software we sometimes fail to recognize that that's what we're doing, but perhaps even substantial portions of the time. Like I have an API that I support and maintain, and pretty much what it does is it accepts JSON and puts it in a database, and then takes it out of the database and turns it back into JSON. Now, there are some hard problems that we've had to solve in order to sort of make that the kind of thing that lots of people can work together on and do in a reasonable way. But when it comes time to make a new API, it's really just technical work, right? Like, how do we present this data as JSON, accept it as JSON, and stick it in the database? Nothing wrong with that, but I think sometimes we lose sight of that split, and I think that comes back to what you're talking about, right? Like, where we are recognizing somewhat implicitly and somewhat explicitly that the important things right now have a lot to do with engineering, but that technical stuff is also going to be important to us and may be important in a different way when we're 250 people than when we're 70 people. Does that kind of make any sense whatsoever?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's actually one of the big signs, I think, of seniority, like in an engineer, is that there are a lot of engineers that, like you said, they if they are given a problem, they immediately assume this is a really hard problem and how do I solve it? And they make it
from
really
scratch,
complex, right? Like they say like, oh, like, well, I don't know that we can trust these APIs and these tools that are out here. Like, I don't want to use Kubernetes or Docker. Like, I'm going to build my own. Like, we need to do that, right? And that's always something that happens a lot of times in software development and software engineering, is that we can make problems harder than they need to be.
Yeah.
And not look at like the simple way to solve it. It's funny. My grandfather was a engineer. He kind of designed like heating and cooling systems, for like big high schools and things like that. But he was always my favorite to work with around the house. Like, he would come down to help my mom out and fix stuff around the house, and I'd be like the gopher, right? Like, I'd just tag along and like hold things for him. But he always had this knack for just fixing things with never replacing them. Like, he would not buy a new thing. Like, I remember as I got older and I was like helping, kind of reversed, and I'm helping him, and I'm like, oh, like the lock is, the knob to this door is kind of funky. I'm like, I can go get another one for $20 at Home Depot. And he's like, no, hold on, let's look. He's like, no, look, if we put a spacer behind the screw on it, like, it fixes it. Right. Like, and it's like, he didn't want to make the problem harder. And I wonder if that's just from the seniority, like being an engineer, of like I've dealt with the really hard problems of like how to sufficiently heat and cool a 3,000 person high school. And, this solving this lock problem, it's like, let's not make it a harder problem of replacing the whole thing. Like, I know there's a small way we can do this.
Right.
And I think that's just something that comes along with like the seniority and have seen enough stuff as an engineer that you don't, like, not every problem is a hard problem. Like, some of them are really easy, but sometimes if you give it's almost like the middle ground, right? If you give a technician, a simple, straightforward problem, they will solve it simply and straightforwardly. If you give them a really hard, gnarly problem, they will probably solve it like kind of in a naive way that runs into problems. But if you give a, kind of mid-level engineer, somebody in the middle, you can give them a simple problem and they will make it hard, right? They will build their own like dependency injection framework or something to like build, the API you talked about, right? They're like, well, what if in the future we don't want to put it in the database and we want to put it in S3, or we need to send it to the other side of the world? Like, how do we put a messaging queue in between these things? And it's like, guys, like, JSON in, put it in the database, bring it out. Like, that's all we're done. Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I totally agree. That's and this kind of also touches on the thing that I forgot earlier that I want to talk about, which is leadership. I don't remember if we've talked about this on the show before or not, or if I've talked to you about it before or not, but this would be super interesting to get your take on. So I'll spew my little, half-baked thoughts, and then you can tell us what you think. So I think that it's really interesting to look at the military. And this is in a specific way. To be clear, I never served, so like I don't have inside experience here. But one of the things that I think is true is that the military has this distinction between the non-commissioned officers. So this would be the ranks up to sergeant, and then you have the officers, right? The commissioned officers, so lieutenant and up. And again, I've never served, so I'm maybe getting some of the details wrong, but I think the broad outlines hold. And what's interesting is that if you talk to people in the military, they will tell you that there's leadership at all levels, right? And what's really interesting to me is that you have this strict hierarchy, right? So the most junior lieutenant straight out of college outranks the most senior sergeant in the army in the sense of, being able to issue orders. But it's more subtle than that, in that the sergeant major of the army, which I believe is the highest NCO in the army anyway, like if you had a fresh faced lieutenant, 22 years old, she's straight out of college, although she may be able to issue those orders, in truth, it actually goes the other way, and the sergeant is going to phrase suggestions in a way that are not really suggestions because they have so much experience, and that those tracks are separate in the military. In other words, that you can progress your career in the NCO track or in the officer track, and they're different things. And sometimes I think about that. Again, it's not perfect, but I think it's an interesting analogy because, in classic software, you were referring to some of this stuff earlier, like wearing a tie or whatever. Like there's the whole, up or out, right? Like where, you become the most senior engineer and then you become the most junior, middle management, right? And how that's not really a great idea, but that leadership exists at all levels. And I think this is something that we've done a pretty good job of at Kevel, I think in part because the organization is, we're definitely not the military, right? Like we're not solving the same problem and we don't have like strict hierarchy or like there's not a lot of orders being issued or whatever, but like there are managers and there are individual contributors, some blurry lines at the size we're at right now. But I feel like if you're an engineer, that you can keep going, that you can advance your craft, and that it is important, even if you're an individual contributor, to be thinking about leadership. How do you provide leadership to those around you, to those in general with less experience? But I think it's not always that simple. So all of which is a bit, I guess, a little bit unformed. But I guess what I'm really asking is, how do you view leadership, and how have you tried to shape how leadership happens at the company, in particular around this this notion of there being sort of different categories of jobs? Like you have management, that's clearly it's clearly a leadership position, but is there leadership within the individual contributors? How does that relate to this notion of engineer and technician aspects of the job? That kind of thing. I hope you can see how I kind of blurred those together and didn't do a good job of explaining it, but they're related in my mind, and I wonder if you agree.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting because I totally think that in the past, I remember a couple of times companies I worked at where, there was a really good engineer, right? Been doing it for 15, 20 years and they wanted to make more money, right? Like they wanted to move up. And so they would get promoted to be an engineering manager. And then their job was, instead of, solving this company's hardest problems and doing an amazing job at it, their job was doing one-on-ones and working on development plans and, sitting in meetings with other development managers. And they weren't good at that.
Sure.
Right. Like they weren't good at it, but they wanted to make more money and they wanted to, move up in the organization. So they would take those promotions and they, were usually unhappy and they usually didn't do a very good job. And I think like at some point in the last, like, I don't know if it's been the last 10, 15 years, like the industry as a whole, I think has realized that like it is there needs to be a dual track. And that if you are going to be an amazing software engineer and you just want to continue to be an amazing software engineer, like there should be a track for you where you can continue to advance and make more money and get more options and things like that, as opposed to like having to go into management as like the next step.
Right.
And I think like the culture, like, I think at Kevel, we've done this, but I think largely in the industry, it's happened as well, where, you start to notice that senior engineers actually make more money than engineering managers now, I think on as a whole, right? Like a very senior principal engineer. And I think that's because people have recognized that, engineering manager is a different role. It's not it's not on the track of being an engineer. Right. There might be engineers who do want to go become engineering managers, but it's not like this logical track from engineer to engineering manager. And I think from like the military, I think it does track really well, right? Because you can have, you can have cases where you have really experienced software engineers, 20, 30 years experience working for an engineering manager who's been doing it for 3 years, right? Which seems a little bit awkward, but that engineering manager is going to say, like, my job is to have you not sitting in this cross functional meeting that you don't need to be in.
Right.
Or, I'm going to be, I'm going to do the one-on-one, and I'm not going to be telling you how to be a better engineer, right? I'm going to be asking you, like, what's slowing you down, and give you the opportunity to say, oh, it's this other team won't, they're behind on X. And you're like, okay, let me go help you with that. Right. And so it does kind of flips it a little bit. And I do think it's like a big part of leadership is just trying to think of it as, kind of the idea of like servant leadership, which I think, in I don't know if it's like this in the military, but I think like the best organizations, the leaders are really thinking about how am I enabling the team, right? Like it's like the engineering managers thinking, how am I making my engineers more efficient and happier and stick around, instead of saying like, I'm the one who's going to tell them everything to do.
Right. You work for me, but the purpose of your work is me.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think, and from the military, like I think, like one of the things I think about a lot is, and I think we've tried to do this. We don't always do it, but it's one of the things I kind of aspire to, is in the military, when you think about how they're, coming up with plans and giving instructions and things like that, right? Like at the end of the day, it will go down to the, the sergeant, and I'm not familiar with all the different ranks, to say like, the objective is to take that hill. And I think the way to do it is that we go around here or we go here. Most of my knowledge of this is from things like Saving Private Ryan. So I'm sorry if anybody's listening who knows a lot more about this.
We'll take it as an analogy. It's okay. That's an analogy. It's a loose one maybe, but we'll take it.
There we go. Yeah. So, like maybe the person in charge is helping come up with the plan of like, here's how we're going to take this hill. But at the end of the day, the people on the ground all know that the objective is to take the hill. The objective is not to follow the plan. It's not to say, oh, we need to go to this river and cross that and come around the back, right? If they see an opportunity for a better way, or if that way doesn't work, right? Or the old, I think, it started, like Eisenhower or somebody, right? It's like the plan, plans are great until they encounter reality.
Right. No plan survives first contact with the enemy, I think is the
right. Yeah. There you go. Yep. Or like, I think the Mike Tyson one is more blunt, right? Like no plan, survives until once you get punched in the face or something like that. But yeah, like, and so I think that's something I try to think a lot about from like a leadership perspective, is really making sure that we're pushing down the objective, not the plan or the tasks. And I think that like, we're not always perfect at that, but at the end of the day, like when you do that, you really do empower, good engineers or good testers or good, anybody. If they understand the objective, they can better contribute than just knowing the plan or just having the tasks. And that was one of the things that always frustrated me when I would work at companies and get, sat down with, here's your 3 Jira tickets, like implement these objects. I remember I went to one job where it was like, here's a sequence diagram, like implement these things. I'm like, I have no clue what this is doing. So I guess I'm just literally, like a code monkey, right? Like I'm just literally implementing what you've told me to implement. And honestly, I could write a program to implement this stuff better, to take the inputs and do it. But I think from the military, like that leadership principle of, being able to push the objective all the way down. And I think it ties back to kind of your lieutenant, like sergeant dynamic, because sometimes you need a more experienced person who's actually going to go take that hill. Right. It can't be a really experienced lieutenant that says, hey, we need to take that hill, and then send a bunch of, privates out to try to do it. Right. You need somebody in there who has that experience, who maybe is even more senior than the lieutenant. And sometimes maybe they disagree that we should take the hill. But once they agree on the objective, that like, this is the objective, they're going to work towards that objective. And maybe it diverges from the plan, but that's not what's important. What's important is the objective, that at the end of the day, they end up with the hill.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I think it is something that you do a pretty good job with. I mean, I know that, and this, I include myself in this, because like I said, I feel like I have a leadership role inside the company as well, in a different way, but it's still true. I think we're still learning what is required in terms of how we communicate objectives, because and the other thing is it's a moving target, man. I mean, like when we were, I said 12, 15 people 4 years ago. Well, obviously we moved through, that to 20 and then to 30 and to 40 and now to 70. And, we're going to be 100 and it won't be that long from now. And at different sizes, different strategies are called for. And so like a part of the challenge is, shifting. But I think one of the things I've said to people is, one of the great things about James is that he is an engineering CEO who, and I always stop at this point to say, and keeping in mind that generally speaking, when I see an engineering CEO, that's a red flag, right? Like, I mean, it's, again, I think you're not this way, but like, I really don't think that engineering CEOs are often, quite frequently, they have a problem. And the problem they have is that they're in love with technology. They're in love with solutions specifically. And I think this is what you're talking about. It's a place where you do much better than that stereotype is that you are not in love with particular solutions. If you might propose one, you might say, hey, I think we need a new API that looks like this to solve this problem. And I'd say, well, actually we have an existing thing that if you just do this, it would work better. And you'd be like, oh yeah, that totally achieves the objective. Let's do that instead. So is that something that you explicitly seek to cultivate in yourself? Like because I mean, I know you're an engineer and I'm an engineer too, and we have this in common, and it's very easy to get attached to the how. Is it just in your nature that you don't do that as much, or is it something that you've worked to cultivate?
Yeah, I think I still actually do it too much, where I think Tim maybe shields you from a little bit more of it. But no, I mean, you see it too. Like, I still think too often I come with a solution and not a problem. And I think about, I think just from like the concreteness of it and thinking like, here's the API that will solve this problem. And I know recently there's one where I'm like, this API should solve this problem. And you're like, well, it actually doesn't solve the problem.
Yeah, but the thing I'm saying is that, yeah, exactly.
But
that's
the
where
part,
it is.
like
That's where
the
it is.
Okay part, right?
Yes, exactly.
And I think that, and I think that like, that's where it's really just been over time of running the company. And like, as I've stepped further and further back from, actually writing code and things like that, I've had to learn my own limitations, but even, not just on the engineering side. Like, I think that was pretty easy to say, these guys are all smarter than me, guys and gals are smarter than me. But I think like from the product standpoint, I think it's when I get to pair up with really good engineers, and I'll come with a solution. And then a lot of times, a good engineer will say, well, what problem are you trying to solve? Which is great, helpful for me. Because then we talk about the problem. And then sometimes we go round and round, over time, talking about how we could solve this and different ways to solve it. And sometimes we end up back at my solution, but more often than not, we end up at something that is better than what I came up with. Mm-hmm. And I think part of that's just like humility. And I think that's, something a lot of CEOs, aren't very good at, right? Is like, I don't have to be the one to come up with the perfect solution. There's times I'll go talk to you or Paul or Tim or, any of our other great engineers, and I'm really high on like what I'll come up with, and they will come up with something, 2 to 3x better, or know how to solve it in a way that I didn't even think about.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, like, like what I care about is like us being successful. Mm-hmm. Like I care about the company being successful, not, me being the one that figured out how to make it successful. Mm. But I also think that like, it goes back to, I don't derive, like, I don't think successful code is like that it's good because I came up with it, or that it's good because it necessarily, does a certain thing or is clever or is fast. Like, to me, I think this is like the business part of it. And why I gravitated that way is that to me, it's like the ultimate thing is, will somebody give you $1? Mm. Right? Like that's like how we've decided to measure most success in our economy is like, will somebody give you money for it? And so at the end of the day, I just look at like, if we can solve a problem and somebody will pay us for it, like that's the ultimate success of like what we've built. Right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the problem when we talk about like, we haven't talked about like stuff like outside of work as much, but I think that's actually the problem I run into when I think about doing stuff outside of work, and I think about getting more into woodworking or doing things. My mind is just suddenly like, okay, how do I make this a business? Like, how do I,
oh, really? Interesting.
What can I build, and how can I sell it, and what's the efficient way to do this? It just becomes very practical, where like when I originally rebuilt my deck, it was largely because somebody gave me this really massive quote, and I thought, well, how hard can it be to just replace 800 boards, because it's like this big deck, And it turns out it's really hard. I probably should have just paid the people.
Yeah, how long did it
but
take
I had,
you?
Well, let's not talk about that. It was like 3 years,
Yep.
Or 2.5 years. And I enlisted various friends to come help me with it. But
Looks
it was
great, by the way.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know if you have any pictures. We do the when we put the show up, we also put it up on YouTube, and I put pictures on the show notes page as well. But if you have any pictures you'd be willing to share, the deck really does look pretty awesome. I think you should share us a picture if you're willing.
Yeah, I'll definitely find a picture.
Right, cool.
But then you also know of all the other projects I have of the workshop I'm trying to rebuild and things like that. But yeah, like when it comes back to me, I think that one of the challenges with those things is that I do tend to like relate things back to, will somebody pay $1 for this?
Interesting.
And I think that or more practical, right? Like when we talk about woodworking, like really what I do is now all I've ever done is like carpentry, right? Like I'm doing it for the end output, right? Like I'm going to build some shelves in this closet in my office, and it's like, well, I'm going to build them because I don't want to like pay somebody else to do it. And I think it will be enjoyable to build them, but like I really want building them because I want shelves in my closet. So it's very much like the output, not the experience that I'm going for.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And that's quite different to me. Like when I do a thing, I've occasionally gotten the compliment, "Oh my gosh, this is really good. You could sell these." And my reaction is always, "Oh my God, please do not make me bring money into this." And so it's really interesting to me to hear you say that you have that impetus. I'm not sure we've had anybody on the show talk about that as a like a factor in their creative or their making process. Do you think that's a positive thing? It's neutral? How would you characterize that?
I don't know, but I think it's always been the case. Like even, I was thinking back to as a software engineer, lots of people I know will go create, a fun side project, right? Or an open source project, or they just want to tinker with something, right? Like Dave on our team, who has like has written like an open source language for playing music with Clojure. Like to me, every side project I ever did, it was kind of like, okay, how am I going to turn this into something that makes money? And it's interesting because it's not that money like guides my life. I'm not, like I don't look at it as like I need to make money to
you're not
to
like
do
that.
certain things or get as rich as possible. Like I just think that to me, it's always been that's the metric of success. And it's not about having the money to spend it. It's about like, this is a way to prove that it's like providing value to people.
So validation, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Like it's like how to validate it, right? Is that you can, create money from it.
That is interesting because I think the place where I go that might be similar, and I think a lot of developers go, is it's not money, it's attention. Right? Like here I am, I'm making a podcast, and I say things like, I don't care if we have 10 listeners or 10 million, but I wouldn't object if this show had suddenly 150,000 listeners. We're definitely not there right now. I mean, so like, like why am I doing it, right? Because I'm doing it because first of all, I like talking to the interesting people we have, but like, why not just record it and leave it on a hard drive? Why do the extra work to put it out on the internet? Why do people make a thing and then, put it up on GitHub? Like, why are they sharing it? And I think it might be similar in the sense that attention is the currency of those types of efforts. And that's a fascinating thing to think about, that you have it perfectly legitimate. I mean, that's not criticism whatsoever, that you've decided that attention in the form of somebody being willing to part with money like that. I mean, that really, like, it's one thing to say I downloaded your open source project, but if you want to really prove that somebody wants your stuff, like, make them give something up.
Right.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And I think that, and I don't know, like we're going to turn it into a therapy session here. Like, I don't know where that,
it's my show. We can talk about it.
I just like, and I don't know where that necessarily came from, but it's definitely the case. Right. And I think like, I've looked at, when I talk to other engineers, like back when we were doing side projects, they would measure success by like the GitHub stars.
Sure.
And I'm like, that's useless. Right. Like, like if I was running this podcast, right, like I'd be like thinking, okay,
yeah.
So if we get to this number of people, who could sponsor this?
Right.
Like, how would we get a sponsorship? And then once we have that sponsorship, like that's money coming in. And that means like we've been successful. But that's
so James, did you just volunteer to become my business manager?
Well, let's set some goals here.
Okay. We'll talk about it offline.
But yeah, no, it's funny. Like that's just the way I think. And yeah, I don't know where that came from, but it's definitely like, I think it's why I struggle more with doing things just for like the pure pleasure of doing them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's why even when I play games and things like that, we talked about board games earlier, but the same with video games and things like that, like they need to be competitive in some way. Like there needs to be, and maybe that's where money comes back to, just like competition. But they need to be competitive in some way and not, and yeah, I don't feel like I do them just for the pleasure of doing them, which is also a problem when I get into stuff, right? Because it's like, if I'm going to do something, I think about how do I be the best in the world at this? And a lot of times it's not going to be the case, right? Like, we're going to learn to play guitar. Like, the window is past where I can be the best in the world at guitar.
I hear you there. Yeah. Gosh, super, super interesting. And I think we could keep going, but I noticed that we are coming towards the end of the block of time that we have allocated. I do always like to leave room. Well, first of all, we have a final question I want to ask you that I warned you about earlier that our listeners are probably already know about, but I always like to leave room at the end of the show and say, okay, well, I would love to continue talking about many things. You've brought many things to my mind that I want to keep digging on. But before we go, is there anything that you think we need to talk about? And it's fine if not. And it's also fine if there's something, but you think we should talk about it next time. Because like I said before, definitely going to have you back on. But before we go, anything you want to discuss before we sign out?
No, nothing comes to mind. Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Cool. Well, then we will jump to our last question, which, as longtime listeners, well, as long as they can be anyway, for a podcast that's only been around for a couple of months, will know, is a piece of advice. I ask you for a piece of advice, and this can be anything from advice you've been given, advice you like to give, advice you just simply like, but I want to hear what you have to offer in the way of advice.
So this is kind of funny now, because this is a quote I like to use. It's a Seth Godin quote. And I think it'll tie back to the conversation we were just having, which is funny because I picked this, I realized I would do this when you gave me a heads up with the question, which is from the book, The Dip, which is a book I read usually about every year. And it's kind of like, it's basically like, should you quit is how The Dip works. Huh. And one of the quotes from it is quit or be exceptional. Average is for losers. So it's a very opinionated point. But something that I think The Dip is a really good book for people to read and to think about is just when a lot of times we have momentum in doing something and we get caught up in that momentum. And it's really hard for you to say, like, I'm going to take the loss, right? Or I'm going to, sell this investment that hasn't been working out. Like, people want to hold on to make it successful. And it applies to lots of things. And The Dip is like, kind of presents this framework. But it can be distilled down into kind of, either can you be exceptional at this, otherwise quit and find what you can be exceptional at. And so it's probably why I have a hard time learning guitar, because I don't feel like I can be exceptional at it. But yeah, that's the thing I'd leave everybody with.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I love it. I feel like we could do a whole show on how that applies to the get smarter and make stuff, right? Like, that is definitely about being on an upward trajectory. And I think there's something to dive into there, but we will leave it there because I know that you have to go and I've already kept you past time. And I super appreciate you coming on the show today. James, thanks so much for coming on. It was really great to talk to you.
Awesome. It was great to be here, Craig.
All right. We're cool. We will leave it there. Hopefully something somewhere in here has inspired everyone else there to get smarter and make stuff. You have been listening to Get Smarter and Make Stuff. I'm your host, Craig Andera. Visit the show online at getsmarterandmakestuff.com. That's all spelled out, all one word. Go there to subscribe to and comment on the show, read the blog, view the gallery, and find a link to the Get Smarter and Make Stuff YouTube channel. Come on by. We're also on Twitter at Make Smart Stuff. If you enjoyed the show and feel like sharing with others you think might like it too, I'd certainly appreciate it. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.